Welcome to the Exhorter podcast, where it is our aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. Today, our subject is coming from Paul Nerlin. Paul, what do you have for us today?
Thanks, Kyle. Hey, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to talk a little bit about a legacy of faith and our responsibility as Christians to leave that legacy with the next generation. You know, recently I've been looking at legacies in other areas like athletics. I look at the Manning family and think, okay, they've got a legacy of amazing quarterbacks, or there may be other legacies within a family that are left. Maybe somebody will look back and say, hey, my grandfather served the military, so did I. It's a legacy that's been passed down through time. But when we talk about a legacy of faith, I think about the scriptures in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. You know, Hebrews 11 gives us many heroes of faith, and it's just one of those great chapters to read to talk about, you know, people who did some amazing things in the Bible. But it says at the end of verse 4, it says, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. And when I read that verse, I think about first our own legacy of faith, of how that, all of us, maybe you listening here today, how did you come about your faith? And not just from your parents, but how did it come to you? And there's a story behind that wasn't accidental. And if you think about how it came to you. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about here in this episode.
Well, I love Hebrews chapter 11, but I like how it connects directly into chapter 12, because I think about this often too, about those who have come before me. And it says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Talks about all those great heroes of faith as a cloud of witnesses. And I like to picture not just the people mentioned in Hebrews 11, but even those in my life that, like Abel, though dead, still speak to me. I like to picture them as a cloud of witnesses as I'm running my race.
So we talk about legacy. When my father died last year, we went through a lot of paperwork and things. And so from my grandfather who died during COVID as well. So, you know, and I found out that Kyle and I have a pretty interesting connection way back in the past. My grandfather attended Garden Grove Church of Christ in Oregon. And I had this letter where he was being exhorted or rebuked by a specific elder there because of his perspective and his thoughts on it was the Lord's Supper.
It was Cottage Grove. And
Cottage Grove.
The elder was Roy Goodwin running your false teacher, grandfather out.
Running him out of town. And so he left and he went to California, and he went down here south.
Not quite Hatfields and McCoys, but we've mended that that broken fence. We had
our own debate on that one. We should probably get that one on a podcast. But we do need that beard, you know, back-to-back photo of, you know, Goodwins and Bradfords. But anyways, so that started him on a path. He wasn't preaching then, but he would preach at about 20 different congregations. Grandpa was an elder and a preacher, and my dad became an elder, and it was just the way it was for our family. And I think that I just never knew anything different.
So I just think it's ironic that when Roy Goodwin, my great-grandfather, kind of influenced your grandfather, Max, is that right?
Max Bradford.
Bradford to move to California. A few generations later, Max's grandson, you, influenced me to move to California.
Yeah. Well, turnabout's for play.
So it's interesting. You've got a legacy of faith, John, and apparently that your ancestor legacy it connects to Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about legacy, and some of you within the congregation here at Clovis have heard this from my father, but when I think of a legacy of faith, I think of my great-grandfather. His name was Ole Nerland. He was from Norway, you know, born there in the 1880s, and he immigrated to the United States in 1903. Later, he came to southern Alberta, Canada, about 1909. Not a believer in any way, but he was a homesteader out in the fields doing work, and he had an experience. He was driving 4 horses and a reaper binder, which I need to go see what that is. But he was driving that through the field when a thunderstorm caught him. He was out in the field quite a ways from his house, and a lightning bolt literally struck him. So he literally could say he was struck by lightning in his story. He had to be taken to the hospital. He was seriously burned, and he was in the hospital for several weeks, and he was never able to return to the fields again. He really had permanent injuries. But while he was in the hospital, he didn't have really much to do. And so there was a Bible. And so he started reading the Bible. And as he read the Bible, he became more and more concerned as he was reading what he read about the church and the Bible compared to the Lutheran church that he had been part of growing up. It didn't seem consistent with what he was reading in the Bible. So he really began searching for a church that was like the one that he saw in the Bible. Didn't even have English as a first language. And so he was trying to seek this out as he went. He heard a radio broadcast that was originating from Saskatchewan, Canada. And he wrote wherever the origination of this was, he wrote a letter to them wanting more information. And apparently there was a speaker that was coming back. That speaker was in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, one of the greatest names in Canada, where my mother was born. And he went to attend a gospel meeting. He had Bible study with the preacher who was there. And he realized after doing that he really needed to become a Christian. And so at 60 years of age, he was baptized into Christ, came back to his hometown of another unique name, Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada. And his first convert was my great-grandmother, which her name was Valborg Nerland. We got great Norwegian names here, Ole and Valborg Nerland. And then he started trying to find other people to join this church. He wrote tracts, which my dad still has some of these tracts that he would write. He printed them and he went into the park and started giving them out. And again, English was not his first language. It was Norwegian. So when you read these tracts, you can tell English was not his first language. There was some, grammar and other mistakes in it. But he slowly converted others. And one of his other converts was my grandfather. And so that's what got my father and family going to church. And they really started the church in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. And, I don't have to go further than that to say this, here I go back to a lightning strike in 1909 that changed his life, that began many other people in his family and a church in Alberta. In fact, several churches that had members of our family in. And now we've got family from Alberta, Canada to Florida to California. And I think back to not just the fact that he became a Christian and that he chose to seek the truth in the Bible, but the fact that has continued through my grandfather, Oliver Nerland, and then my father, Ken Nerland. And my hope is that I can pass this on to my children. And so you think about that legacy of faith. It's amazing to think about.
Yeah, the names got better too. Ken, Paul.
I don't know. I think those are kind of boring compared to the Norwegian names.
Seriously.
I did mention Big Beaver, Saskatchewan. We'll get to that later. But
now, have your kids said anything about that story? What was their perspective when they heard that story?
I think they're more focused on the fact he was struck by lightning.
That is kind of he lived. Most people don't think you can, but I think my great grandfather was struck by lightning.
He lived, but he was never the same. He was paralyzed on one side, but it was clearly a life-changing experience. But it's just interesting to me that caused him to look at the Bible. And my focus here is less his conversion, but more the fact that faith has continued for generations. And I've got cousins and uncles and aunts all over Canada and the United States that are Christians, some of whom serve as elders or deacons or preachers in different places. And I go back to Ole Nerland in 1909, and I think just that, not just his decision to follow Christ, but clearly to teach the next generation was a key part of that.
To that point, we're talking about purposeful intent, providing and making that legacy. It was creating those tracks. It was baptizing and teaching, deliberately your great-grandfather and your family that got you where you are today. That's probably a very common perspective that a lot of us in the church or have been raised in the church have, where we don't really appreciate the fact that one decision or one person in our family line could have completely derailed our own faith that we have today or caused a different type of life for us,
Well, it makes me think as a Christian, then the responsibility of, I'm thankful for my great-grandfather's conversion, but at this point, it's now my faith, but also a responsibility of I want my children and my grandchildren. And I'm reminded in the book of Judges, chapter 2 and verse 10, we all recall, what happened in the book of Judges, but it says, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. We all know the book of Judges where, they clearly do things their own way, not God's way, but it was one generation. And it just reminds me, all those generations that have been consistent in the faith in my family, it just takes one generation for that to stop. And I don't want that generation to be with me or with my children or my grandchildren. And so that's a responsibility that we have in passing on this legacy of faith.
Well, and sometimes it's not just a matter of failing to put your family or future generations on the correct path. Sometimes influence works in a negative way just as powerfully. You hear about generational abuse, that one generation learns abuse from the older generation, and it's an unfortunate cycle that continues on, or generational poverty. There's a lot of issues like that get passed on in a negative sense. I'm reminded of Jeroboam, first king of Israel, and hundreds of years later, you go to 2 Kings 13 and you read about the end right before the northern kingdom is destroyed by Assyria, and you get introduced to Jehoahaz. And it says that he followed the sins of Jeroboam. And then later on, you just look through all these kings. Pekahiah, the sins of Jeroboam. Menahem, the sins of Jeroboam, all his days. Pekah, he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. And even down to their very last kings for generation after generation, and these kings are not flesh and blood descendants of him. Jeroboam, by choosing to leave the worship at the temple and establish false places of worship for generations to come and for their entire history, he set them down a path of sin.
It's an interesting question for those at home to think about. We all sin. We all fall short. Are there any in what sins or shortcomings you have in your life that could be picked up by your kids or your further generations that could be continued based upon your influence, based upon their example? And just think of that. Is there something you're doing in your life right now that you are setting generations on a certain path?
I don't mean to suggest that we're not going to have sin in our lives unless we're having unrepentant, continual sin that could influence our children or grandchildren. But if John, to your point, we're going through the motions. We've talked about this before. We've got, my grandparents went to church, my parents went to church, I go to church, and I'm a few generations removed from being struck by lightning. I didn't have a dramatic story like that. I didn't sit in a hospital and read the Bible and find it myself. I was taught that by my parents. Later, I discovered it myself and it became my faith. But at the end of the day, to your point, if you're going through the motions, if you're listening to this, you are the product of multiple generations in the church. One of the dangers I think our kids or grandkids may see is, do we remember why we're here? Do we have the enthusiasm of that new convert? Like my great-grandfather, who was literally writing tracts in another language, giving them out in the park, trying to find people because he was so enthusiastic after this finding the truth. Have we lost that over time because it's been, as you said, what we've always known?
Let's say that you have a perspective on something like gambling, right? I think it's okay to do X, Y, or Z. And that becomes a habit in my life. And now I've set that perspective for my kids and my generation. And you might be able to process those in a certain way, but you have really no control over how your kids or grandkids might process that or think about that later on. They might just look back and say, well, Dad didn't have a problem with that. And it could be any number of topics. I think that that's one of the things that's important about trying to set one apart from the world and to kind of walk away from the line is so that if it dilutes over time, you'll still have faithful Christians.
I think the point you're making, John, is the choices that we make today reverberate, whether that's a sin in our life or something we choose to do that our kids say, I guess that's okay. But I think that still goes back to our kids looking to us. And if we don't really practice what we see in the Bible, if it's not real to us, it's not real to them. And that's why we see generations falling away, because they see people who may rate their Christianity by, well, I go to church every Sunday, but during the week, they really don't live the way the Bible speaks to. And therefore the kids say, why am I doing this?
Well, it's incumbent on us as parents to display a zeal for God. If we talk about a legacy, that's what I want my kids to learn and see from me, is that I'm passionate about God, because I've been on both sides of this. I've been at churches where, as a preacher, I move, and I've been at churches where I have zero history or connection. But growing up, I've been at churches where great-grandpa Roy was an elder there, where there's been 3 or 4 generations of Goodwins all in the same church. And it can be easy to lose sight of the reason why you're there and just more think in terms of, we built this church. You start thinking of it as, it's my church because we've got family roots here. And that's the wrong perspective. So that's the legacy we want to leave to our children, is I want them to see that I really love the Lord, that I'm passionate about God, not just that I have a stake in the church or something.
So I think the point of this in leaving a legacy of faith is to start thinking about our faith generationally and realizing that we've been given this faith, but it's beyond just us. Every choice we make, everything we do. And by the way, when we talk about family, I'm not just talking about parents. I'm talking about grandparents. I'm talking about uncles, aunts, cousins. You have an influence on those around you. Maybe it's your friends, maybe it's people around you, and they see what you do. We have been, if you will, entrusted with this faith, and what we do will, John, to use your words, reverberate, for generations to come. What are we going to do with that? And how will we ensure that that faith is passed on?
We just concluded VBS, and we're going to have some podcast episodes here coming up where we discuss some topics of inquiry with the kids. We asked them some questions, and we have a recording of their answers. And some of those were about hypocrisy in the church and things like this. As you were saying, they see it. They see people phoning it in, not necessarily living their faith. And man, there's so many people I grew up with that I heard the same thing from. So we're talking about a couple generations now of people being spoon-fed or really not living in their faith out. We'll talk about that more, but it's definitely seen by our youth, and that's scary. And it reminds me of the Israelites going multiple generations without talking about things or without living that faith, and suddenly, where's the church? And we've seen many churches of Christ in especially California and other places that just aged out. They didn't have the youth. They didn't have that focus and zeal on God's word, and they no longer exist. And that's a scary anecdote about where we're facing. So it's that much more important that we think about and care about the legacy that we provide and we put out there, not just for our own kids, but for the church as a whole.
So to that point, and that's a nice teaser, John, I can't wait to hear those episodes as we work on those and play those. To the point of entrusting, I'm reminded in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, Paul said, "The things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." So part of that is making sure that we're living it, but also we're teaching them. And I think we're finding, John, to your point, as churches go on, we may not be teaching our kids the reason why. Why do we do certain things? Why do we not do certain things? I'm thankful, we've got a great high school, college age group here at the church in Clovis. Kyle is going to be taking over the high school class beginning in our new semester here at Clovis. And you're going to be talking about Bible authority and why we do what we do and getting really practical about why that is so important. And I know I'm thankful that my girls are in that class with you because it's so important. But I do feel that many of our younger kids in the next generation may not know that. They for myself, John, to your point, we didn't live through the institutional, non-institutional splits in the 1950s, but our parents and our grandparents
we heard about it a lot.
Yeah, we heard about it,
kids,
but we didn't live through it. And so we got to make sure we understand some of those things. But now talk about our kids and our grandkids. They're yet another generation removed. And so they weren't around to see, well, what happened? Why did it happen? What are the differences? So it's so critical that we treat this as something that we have been entrusted with, but also we teach that next generation so that they can teach the same things.
That's one of the things I've appreciated from Scott Young in the past few years, maybe about 10 years. He's had a large focus on trying to make sure that we've understood the divisions and the issues within the church in the past 50 years, because they do tend to come back around and they tend to affect the church in different ways. And I think that's really important to study and to understand the church's legacy as a whole, because nothing's new under the sun. If you stop talking about authority for one or two generations, it's amazing how far away you can get.
Well, I think of one of the most influential people that I barely knew. He passed away when I was maybe 7 years old, as my Uncle Mike, my mom's brother. And I shared in a sermon recently his story. How as a kid, he left a confusing legacy to me that I never understood why he never married. And I didn't know what AIDS was, but I was scared of it when my parents told me that my Uncle Mike had AIDS and was probably going to die in the next couple years. But I do remember going to church with him towards the end of his life. And I remember finding that sermon that he preached right there in the last few months before he got really sick, warning the youth in that congregation to think about the consequences of their actions. And I think there's something very powerful too in being willing to admit when maybe something was wrong, or to show where you might have gone in error. And so there's something powerful too about that idea of exposing things that were wrong, in honestness and transparency. And that, because we know a lot of the Gen Z generation that's growing up, they struggle with hypocrisy. If we've done some things that might come across to them as hypocritical, or maybe some teachings, we didn't grow up in that Church of God, Church of Christ split, the institutional issues. Maybe there were some overcorrections here or there too. And it might be worth exploring those.
In studying and thinking about it and talking to people, that the millennial generation just before that were a lot more cynical than even the Gen Z is about hypocrisies in the church. A lot more cynical about those things. I see some senses of hope with the Gen Z. They do have hope. They have a lot more hope. Yes, they see some of the hypocrisy, but they're trying to understand and they don't want it, right? So it's a less negative. It's a little bit more hope in there. And so I do have a lot of hope as well for the next generation in the way that they process and they look at the church as a whole.
Jeroboam, for example, I don't think he intended to lead Israel down the path of absolute rebellion and sin. He had good intentions when he instituted the places of worship at Dan and Bethel, but he still set them on that course.
But I think, Kyle, I think of myself, and you're about to teach a class on Bible authority. I will confess that I remember as a youth when I would hear, you're going to go into a Bible class about Bible authority. I will admit I was not overly excited. It didn't sound real. It sounded like I was going into a doctrinal class about a particular issue. And I like the way Doy Moyer set it up in his book about authority. Appropriately titled "Mind Your King," and he really starts with the declaration from Isaiah 52 and verse 7, which is the idea of your God reigns. This is all his. And if you respect his authority, Matthew 28, 18 to 20, all authority has been given to Jesus Christ. If you respect that authority and you love him, you're going to want to do what he says. And he takes it from that perspective. And if we don't begin there, then it sounds very theological. It's in our minds, but not in our hearts. And so I think when we're talking to our youth about this, we've got to make sure that the why is a key part of what we talk about.
That's a very good practical way that we can set ourselves and our children and generations on a better path, right? Always explaining why we do what we do. I know that your daughters ask those questions a lot, right? And so a Bible class now to a high school class about authority is probably seen a lot differently when you start saying, why do we do our church services this way? So that's a great thing if they're interested and they're looking at that. Are there any other practical ways that we can set this course correctly, that we avoid this reverberation of away from the church on a day-to-day path? Any other thoughts on that?
Well, modeling genuine Christian virtue. Involving the younger generation in the good works that we're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that the young generation that's growing up now is really eager to see, is faith put into action. I think they want to see genuine action, not just talk. And I'm reminded of how much of influence is really unconscious. It's about setting a good example. You might not even be aware that you're setting an influence or having an influence on others. So be doing the right things and involve them with.
I think that's good, Kyle. John, to your question, at the end of the day, number one, we need to be intentional about this. And so as a Christian, if you're listening to this, you need to realize every choice you make, everything you do, we should be intentional about trying to teach all those around us. Maybe it's not just your kids, maybe it's people you influence, but also to realize that the implications of Jesus being Lord and Jesus being given all authority is that requires complete submission to him in every aspect of our lives. And so, one, we're intentional about it. Two, we demonstrate it in our lives, which means if we're doing things we shouldn't be doing, to your point about kids looking at hypocrisy, we will lose credibility with them. When Thomas confessed that he believed in Jesus, he says, "My Jesus and my God." He completely believed in Jesus and who he was, but we've got to demonstrate that in our lives. So be intentional, live the way we say we believe, and take every opportunity to teach them why we believe what we believe.
Well, and Paul, what you're saying really resonates with me. There's only so much explanation you can give, and at some point you simply have to demonstrate. That's something we're going to talk about in our study on authority with the teenagers. You can only tell so much. If you're teaching your newborn how to walk, you can't explain it to them. You just have to show them. You have to hold them up and let them figure it out. The way I learned to sing. Now, when you don't know anything about music, your ear is attached or attracted to the melody, and that's what you end up singing, the main melody line. But sitting by my grandpa, he would sing bass, and I would hear that he's singing different notes than the guy leading the song. And so I started just copying grandpa. And then as I got into band and learned a little more about music, I got adventuresome and said, I'm going to try to sing the harmony part. I'm going to sing tenor. And grandpa could hear I was trying and not being very successful. So he would start to sing tenor to demonstrate it for me. And that's how I learned to sing. It's probably not a great commendation for my grandpa. I'm not the best singer, but I learned just by him demonstrating. So, Paul, if I'm understanding what you're saying, we've got to know our source material. We've got to know what God expects of us. We've got to walk the walk. We've got to demonstrate it for our kids and also have good explanations, a good reason to tell them why. Well, I hope this episode of the Exhorter podcast has been an encouragement to you and a reminder to you that you're casting a shadow of influence every day of your life. Make it a good influence. Make it a good example that you're sharing with others. Be conscious of how your example might influence even generations to come. We thank you for being with us today. If this podcast has been helpful to you, we hope you'll like and subscribe and follow for more content.